Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Wednesday, August 5th, 2020. Time for yet another show. Bill knows, even though, are you in hurricane-racked Maine? Were you hurricane-racked? Anybody get hurricane-racked? Greg got hurricane-racked, so he won't even be here today. How do you like that? Now, this is an interesting story, I thought, just because we all know the background of it. We all heard Greg's generator being installed right in the middle of the show. You remember this, right? And, so through comes the hurricane, right? Knocks out power in much of Connecticut. I understand the power company there, by the way, apparently goes by the name of Eversource. Not so ever, after all, I guess. Usually Source really would be a good name for them, but power goes out pretty regularly up there, especially during the winter or summer storm season. Occasionally in the winter storms when the ice and snow comes through. That's why he's got the whole house generator, right? Only the thing is, plenty of electricity, no internet. That we didn't get a whole house generator for. So now, next project, we will hear construction. Abby will be going crazy in the background as they build and launch their own communications satellite for Greg's house. I think that's probably a good idea, just to make sure that the show can go on, because that's what it must do, apparently. That's the way the saying goes. So that's law as far as I'm concerned. So yes, we'll miss out on Greg today. However, I'm sure we can, as usual, lean on him for a couple of stories from time to time. He won't be able to listen to the show live because he can't stream the internet. But you know, he occasionally plants a few stories that we don't get to in time, and we can probably mine the original source there and see what we can't come up with. Anyway, Daily Co's Radio is live now. This was the first thing Bill had to say for us in the morning. Kagro X, me, David Waldman, has a great contest. It's a terrific, beautiful, beautiful contest. Everyone should enter it. Be the 50th caller, or the 40th, or some number, or any number really will do, and you'll win a free Hatch Act violation on your choice. It's true, and we'll pardon you too. Must be 18 or older. Just kidding. In fact, if you're even nearing 18, I don't want to really hear from you. Let's keep it on the young side. I understand my friend Jeffrey used to like it that way. Anyone can violate the Hatch Act now, silly, except presidents, of course. I assume we're talking about reference to, I think the RNC, who actually does know better than this by now, was floating the idea last night. Let's see, I'm pretty sure I retweeted somebody taking note of this rather extraordinary idea, but the RNC floating the idea for Trump's fakey fake convention thing, that he, I guess, give his acceptance speech from the White House lawn. Is that right? Yeah, here we are. Who was the reporter that spread this around for everybody to see? Let's see. Laura Litvin, who covers the U.S. Senate and the 2020 elections, both, incredibly, for Bloomberg News, making note here, crediting the Washington Post, I guess. But she's the one that got the credit for it on Twitter. Everyone was talking about her tweet. The Republican National Convention planners, which would chiefly be those from the RNC, but I suppose they could be Trump's hand-picked people to put his particular spin on the event, and they might be very stupid or crazy like a fox in terms of how they work here. Anyway, their idea is that they would consider having the White House South Lawn as the site of President Trump's nationally televised nomination acceptance speech later this month, according to a Republican familiar with the discussions. Now, what the difficulty there is, of course, that is completely against the law. And let's see, Christine Pelosi, I noticed, tweeting that. Lots of people tweeting that. But, you know, so what, essentially, is the question. What I mean by they're being crazy like a fox is they may very well be thinking, yes, it is illegal to use official resources like this for political purposes, but you can't indict a sitting president, and that means he won't be indicted. And now, of course, lots of people floating all the fun ideas like if he loses the election, that he would resign prior to January 20th and allow Mike Pence to take over as president in exchange for issuing a pardon for him and all of his family members, and maybe some freebie indulgences or something like that, just thrown in as an added incentive. I don't know whether I buy the idea of his considering something like that, although I do agree that he'll become discouraged and disinterested in a critical time, of course, not only because it's a transition of presidential power, but because we'll still be probably mired in this pandemic plus flu season, and God knows what else will be going on. And he'll like walk away. But maybe it might even be for the best. Mike Pence might even be slightly better than Donald Trump. Ideologically, he's no prize. But I think he kind of sort of understands the levers of Washington. And, I suppose he could deliver hot bottled water to dehydrated babies at the correct time. I don't know whether he'd be interested in doing it. Anyway, point is, Donald Trump, goofball and lunatic, remains president for the time being, according to this constitution thing that they keep pointing to. Getting ready for his fake, convention and nomination acceptance speech. Just going to do it wherever the hell he wants, regardless of its legality. No one's going to charge him. No one's going to stop him. So what are you going to do about it? It's a good practical question for beginning the show. Really, honestly, what would they do if he just did that? That's illegal. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's the way it goes. And we're kind of stuck with that, which suggests that it might actually happen. So I have no idea how to predict whether, what's going to come out of that one, except I guess we'll just wait and see. And see whether anybody decides that, you remember optics. The optics of violating the law that blatantly are just bad, and maybe we won't allow you to do it. I don't know. Let's see. Anyway, report on the hurricane from Bill, who has answered our question. The hurricane did come through yesterday in about 2 hours. We got one small spritz of rain, and then it got breezy for a bit. Hurricanes, he says, no, not to mess with Maine. They're blizzard country, and you can only have one kind of storm, I think. You shouldn't be hit by both. We got next to nothing. We're so far inland. Coastal hurricanes, not usually a huge problem for this neighborhood. We also got it wasn't a small spritz of rain, but compared to a hurricane, I guess it was a small spritz of rain. It was a nice, much-needed rain, and it was over with in the morning hours and moved on. This hurricane was really moving quickly. My parents in New Jersey got it worse, and I guess they got the Greg Dworkin version of this thing. Toppled trees, and I mean a big tree, and a big old, I don't know, what was it? Probably an oak tree. My front yard growing up, I remember losing kites in that tree. I don't think, lose any kites in that tree, but it was big, and I guess it had two options in terms of the direction it was going to, it had several options for directions to fall, but I guess had it toppled the other way, it had the choice of taking down all the power and cable and phone lines in the neighborhood, and him blocking the street, or it could topple the other way and smash into the house. And it chose the smash into the house route, so that wasn't so good. But luckily, it fell straight back, and I guess it looked like all the branches, big tree branches, knocked down, gutters, and took a couple of shingles with it, and gave a good dent to the garage roof. But everything else seems to be okay. Hopefully no water leaking in anywhere. I guess they'll find it. So it's just a cosmetic mess at the old homestead, but otherwise okay. And my parents, they seem to get it regardless of where the hurricanes go. They do have they're of that age where they now have a place in Florida, and that's the place that's usually getting clobbered with hurricanes. Although it's a pretty stout little condo there, and so it doesn't tend to get endangered terribly, but trees topple all the time, and then you got to go clean up yard debris, etc. Now they got it here in New Jersey instead, so wherever you go, East Coast anyway, is largely always in danger. I had a lot of damage and flooding in North Carolina, and I got to check in with my mom down in South Carolina and see how they did. But I feel like I would have gotten some kind of emergency panicked texts if they were experiencing bad weather. I think everything seems to have worked out there. You can tell us your hurricane damage story. Send it on to us, and we'll let everybody know the particulars of what's going on at your house and what construction you will be doing during the show to prepare for the next one. Really would like to know what we do about backing up the internet for Greg or for me or for anybody really. We're all tenuously connected to this thing. Anyway, none of us got it as bad as Beirut. Thankfully, I guess we can say that. There was a very strange story out of Beirut, and then we only made it stranger here in the United States because our president is a weirdo and an idiot. But you must have seen, probably like just after the show, it seems like, or was it maybe mid-afternoon, we started seeing tweets of video of these enormous explosions. It looked like at least 2 explosions in Beirut, which... I think we've all become conditioned, even the people in Beirut have become conditioned to expect the worst when there are huge explosions in Beirut. Though things have calmed down considerably over the years, thankfully, it's still a place where you expect the worst when there's a giant explosion. And this was a giant explosion. The video is very, very dramatic. And I had people extraordinarily worried. The size of the cloud emanating from the explosion, the sound of it, the boom, the shattering windows, and then video that captured the explosion, although that probably should have been our first clue that something other than the thing we feared the most, a terrorist, car or building bomb of some kind, or for that matter, a military strike. The fact that it was captured on video by so many people from so many angles held clues to it, I think. And it was that there was a large rising pillar of smoke, and people were filming from a distance what just looked like a large building fire. And I guess it was one because the building that was on fire turned out to be has been variously described as a fireworks depot, which, I don't know if I would ever used the word depot along with that. That sounds like maybe the name of a commercial retail outlet for fireworks. But I guess a fireworks warehouse or factory or something. And it was, anyway, so it turned out to be something quite like that. And then, of course, the various explosive, whatever you would do, the explosive compounds that they use in these things, it must be stored there in bulk, and that was what caused the real problem. Then after a few minutes, we started to see some closer shots of the initial fire that was sending up the pillar of smoke, and you can see, small scale fireworks, although what looked like small scale fireworks, versus the gigantic, and it was mushroom shaped cloud that this final explosion produced, and that had a lot of people worried. People are used to seeing the mushroom clouds with respect to in the aftermath of a nuclear detonation. That had some people on the internet convinced that it was, in fact, a nuclear detonation. It was of the size of a small nuclear detonation, as it turns out. But explosions are what produce dust clouds, and quick, sizable, violent explosions will generally produce that shape of cloud. It doesn't have to be a nuclear detonation to do it. And I guess the telltale flash of light was not present. But what ended up happening, I guess, was when the fire got to, or the heat from the fire got to the ammonium nitrate, the 4,000 to 5,000 tons of ammonium nitrate that had been apparently negligently stored there, unsecured for quite some time. Well, that exploded, and you're talking about an explosion the size of a small yield, I guess, tactical nuclear weapon of 1 or 2 megatons of TNT. Is ammonium nitrate as powerful an explosive as TNT. So it might be that 4,000 or 5,000 tons of ammonium nitrate equals something less of TNT, and that's how you measure the kilotons these days. I don't know. That's the way the kids are doing it these days. Anyway, so it was a huge explosion, and apparently Trump, not satisfied with the possibility that it might just have been I mean, a lot of people were injured and killed. I mean, it looked a lot worse than it turned out in terms of the number killed, but I mean, it was a huge explosion. And as I understand, it was reported that they heard it in Cyprus, which is, another country. So it was quite a blast. Lots of pictures of the damage. Lots of pictures of it looked like 9/11 in the sense of people like wandering the streets covered in blood and dust. But I think, given the size of the explosion and what we were first worrying about, that's actually not a less surprising, or maybe we're surprised by the small numbers of deaths comparatively. I mean, I thought hundreds, thousands. It looked like there was a apartment building had been disintegrated by this explosion, but I guess it was just engulfed in the dust cloud. So I think Beirut got away with one in terms of what it could have been, but what a thing to watch. And then our own president apparently takes the podium for not a briefing about that, because that's not important to him, of course, but just apparently takes the podium and speculates wildly. We all speculate wildly about these things, but the president's not supposed to. But then again, our president is an idiot. And but by that point, we had heard pretty definitively from the authorities in Lebanon. And, maybe they're telling the truth, maybe they're not. But the stories had seemed to come together, and the video seemed to bear out the idea that this was, in fact, a fire at a fireworks warehouse of some kind. And Trump couldn't help but say, yeah, but, maybe it was a military attack on it. And I've talked to some great generals, and they seem to think that it was a military attack. And, of course, it was garbage. And an interesting comment from, I guess, one of the, where did I see this? This was one of the Lincoln Project folks piped up about this thing and saying, how extraordinary it was to him that the president of the United States would take the podium to speak to the country and the world about a major international disaster and to lie about it. And here it is. Yeah, Fred Wellman, who is associated somehow with the Lincoln Project. Let's see. Senior advisor for Veterans Affairs with the Lincoln Project. And he had this to say. He lied. The president of the United States stood at the podium and lied about a major international disaster. And the fact that no one believed him proves how useless and untrusted he has become. No one reacted because we all know he always lies. And that was an interesting point, more so than the fact that he had lied. He was working, by the way, off of the tweet of Ryan Stroik. Does he say Strike? Strike, from CNN. I don't know. I mean, I say, from CNN because you guys, watch that television thing that I skip most of the time. Not because I'm above television, but because when I watch television, I tend to watch garbage. Worse than CNN. I'm not going to learn anything about world events from reruns of Family Feud, although I did see a good movie last night. Anyway, so maybe you would know how he pronounces his name. Struyk, Ryan Strike. Anyway, his tweet about the president's remarks yesterday, he just quotes Trump here. These defense officials, I'm sorry, this is not a quote from Trump, but others. These defense officials who declined to be identified so they could speak freely said they didn't know what the president was talking about. I guess that's his follow-up to the garbage from Trump. And he's got an article on it, too. Maybe we can flip through that during one of the breaks and figure out whether there's anything worth digging out of there. But Fred Wellman was shocked that the president had stood at the podium and lied about a major international disaster. I was struck by his comment, though, about the fact that no one believed him, proving how useless and untrusted he had become. I thought that was the better point, because presidents stand at the podium and lie even about major international disasters from time to time. They do that. We wish that they wouldn't. We might quibble over how big or consequential the lie is, or sometimes whether it is even is a lie. But for instance, I don't know. I guess it wasn't a major international disaster to start with, but for George Bush to stand at the podium and even his vice president, Dick Cheney, who was supposedly really president, standing at the podium and lying about WMD programs in Iraq and their connection to Al-Qaeda, of which there was none, and how we had to invade them. They do stand at the podium and lie about things from time to time. And many presidents do. And depending on, where you're sitting during all this, I'm sure that Republicans would love to tell you about the lies they think Barack Obama told from the podium too. But I thought it was interesting, not just that he had lied about it, and not just that he hadn't been believed about it, though that was the better point that Fred Wellman made, but how, I guess, a good metric of just how untrustworthy Donald Trump really is. Not only were we preconditioned to understand that basically whatever it was he was going to say about this thing was likely to be a lie or at least an exaggeration, but that he went immediately to terrorism, of course, is very telling, but also to be expected from Trump. But just how untrustworthy is Donald Trump? Donald Trump couldn't even sell an explosion in Beirut as a terrorist attack. That's kind of a major and amazing thing to me. I mean, I think it was what came to mind for everybody immediately. Their first thought was, oh my God, there's been a terrorist attack in Beirut. Look at this explosion. I suppose it's possible that a good portion of the citizens of Beirut and elsewhere in the Middle East, I understand that some of their first reactions was, oh my God, there's been an Israeli airstrike. That's another thing that comes to mind for others. It's not usually first thing on my mind, but in America, it would be extraordinarily easy to sell the idea that that explosion had been a terrorist strike, even when you found out it was a fireworks depot. Well, who, how did that come to be on fire? Was that not a terrorist strike? Maybe perhaps a small scale car bomb set off the fire that was strategically targeting this fireworks depot, which, would have been a great plan, I suppose. But the fact that Donald Trump couldn't convince Americans that a major explosion in Beirut was caused by terrorists, I think just speaks to his complete ineffectiveness as a communicator of anything. No one will believe him about anything. Would have been the easiest thing in the world to believe, and he couldn't sell that. And I guess we should be happy that he couldn't. That was just, I thought, the more interesting of the outcomes from his garbage. I should, maybe during the break, as I said, I'll take a look and see what else he said. We were not paying too much attention to what he was babbling about then, because we were still hung up for most of the day on what Trump had babbled in the Axios interview. That really dominated the news of the day, and rightfully so. Now, other things that happened yesterday while we were still obsessing over the interview and the news from out of Beirut, and we were not, as a country, obsessing over the news from Beirut. We liked the explosion footage, and then once we found out it wasn't a terrorist attack, or at least we hope it wasn't a terrorist attack, our attentions turned elsewhere. For instance, I happened to note that, I should have saved this one, so maybe I can find it somewhere out on Twitter, but I saw somebody tweeting a picture. They had gone to the Lebanese embassy in Washington, D.C., figuring that there would be some sort of community candlelight vigil, perhaps, for the victims of this disaster, and that there was none. There was one guy outside, I'm sure probably a Lebanese American, but one guy outside of the embassy lighting a candle. Now, there is a pandemic on, and people are not supposed to get together and large numbers like that. Yes, they were motivated to do so for various protests, but this isn't a protest. It would have been a nice show of solidarity, and maybe in ordinary times that would have happened, or I'm just kind of wondering whether, Trump's America just can't muster the interest to care about anything. We have too much of a disaster going on here in the United States. We can't pay attention to other disasters, or I don't know. Not certain what it was. Though, also ordinarily there would have been some comment from the president, not that, hey, I wish it was a terrorist attack so that we would have an excuse to bomb somebody, but that he would say, all right, well, this wasn't a terrorist attack, but even if it was, we express solidarity with the people of Beirut, and we grieve their losses right alongside them, and, to make some public display, some acknowledgement of what went on, instead of trying to spice it up by making it worse somehow. Well, Americans aren't generally interested in that, but if it was terrorism, we'll pay attention to that. Then we'll have a candlelight vigil against terrorism. But I guess we couldn't muster the interest in a mid-pandemic and immediately post-hurricane candlelight vigil. And we're lucky that the hurricane came through earlier in the day. It would have made a candlelight vigil extraordinarily difficult. High winds and heavy rains. Bad timing for a candlelight vigil. But it was clear weather. We just couldn't muster one, which is kind of embarrassing. Not that I, made my way downtown to join what I thought would have been inevitably the candlelight vigil. I didn't think about it until I saw the picture indicating that nobody had thought about it. So I was a little bit embarrassed about that. But I don't know, just sort of a weird indicator of where we are as a country at this moment. Discombobulated, recovering from a hurricane, suffering under a pandemic that we kind of sort of don't really seem to take seriously, willing to go out and get haircuts and dine in a crowded restaurant and send our kids back to school, but not come out and say, hey, I'm sorry your town blew up for Beirut. Maybe we're just used to that happening. We'll be right back. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to Patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Latest update that I've been able to grab quickly from the newspaper headlines, the explosion in Beirut, 100 people, over 100 people killed, which I would have easily expected them to have exceeded that, so I'm thankful that an explosion of that size hasn't done more damage, although who knows what may happen in the days ahead, as thousands of people were injured, and the hospitals, of course, at or near capacity due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which was, so there's a lump of this on top. And then, as I understand it, one of the largest hospitals in Beirut was damaged to the point where, it could be basically chalked up as total destruction. It's just unusable, I think, as a hospital. So already at or near capacity, losing one of their major hospitals and adding thousands, maybe tens, hundreds of thousands of people in need of hospitalization for their injuries. Really just incredible. And I guess the kind of blast that it was, just a huge repercussion from the explosion and shattered windows and people cut by glass and flying debris everywhere. So really rather incredible. And then, yeah, as I said, nobody showed up at the embassy outside of or in D.C. Now, as it turns out, as I was looking for that tweet, it turns out that there is a planned vigil of some sort for today. So that's good news. I'm glad that that's come up, and maybe they just couldn't organize it that quickly yesterday. Maybe it was too much to expect that large crowd show up yesterday. But I understand, in case you're interested and you're in the area, or maybe you can go to New York. I'm sure there is a Lebanese consulate or a UN presence, certainly, in the New York area if you'd like to do the same. But in D.C., I am informed by a reliable enough looking person on Twitter who says, today those wishing to stand in solidarity with the people of Beirut are planning to bring candles. Make sure they're not fireworks, please. Candles and signs of support and gather outside the Lebanese embassy. Want to go? It's 2560 28th Street Northwest today at 5:30. I hope that the weather is holding out for that. This, let's see, who is this? Mai or May? M-A-I. El Sadani, who has shared this information with her friends on Twitter. And let's see, this comes from, passed on by Daniel Hajar, who announces the time and date, Wednesday, August 5th, 5:30 tomorrow. Nothing official, not organized by anyone, just a few people trying to make this a thing. Let's come together in a socially distanced and safe way. That is going to make things, that's the difficult part. A socially distanced candlelight vigil. It works so much better when people are closer together. But yes, also, though, I was looking for this tweet and, in fact, an entire thread from Molly McCluskey, investigative journalist and editor covering social and economic equality. Where? The Diplomatic Courier. Is that what the Diplo Courier is? Anyway, blue check-marked type of person who says, I've just come from the Embassy of Lebanon in D.C., where I expected to find a crowd gathered in support and mourning. Instead, I found one man lighting a candle. She must have spoken to him because she's an investigative journalist type person. She knows his name is Remy, and it turns out Remy's not even Lebanese. He's Syrian, so adjacent, but says the first thing Remy says to me is, I'm not Lebanese, I'm Syrian. He says he came because he immediately felt the pain of the explosion. Instantly, the city was gone, he said. It'll never be the same. It's not gone, but clearly, heavy impact all over the city, and it'll have some lasting effects, to be sure. The pain of war, Molly says, is on his face, and it's like a living, breathing thing. It seemed to leap off of him like a child trusting it would be caught. Well, okay. She's very expressive about this thing. He's lighting 3 candles, it says here, one at a time, letting the wax burn and drip so that it makes a stand. And let's see, Remy says it's important that he brought 3 and shows a bracelet he's wearing with the Syrian independence flag, 3 stars. Candles lit, he takes out a Lebanese flag that he's brought himself and holds it up in front of himself, glancing up and down now at the nearly empty street. Where is everyone? He asks. I don't know what to tell him. As I'm leaving, I take one last glance at Remy standing there in front of the embassy and its statue of Khalil Gibran, and remember one of the poet's great lines, you may forget with whom you laughed, but you will never forget with whom you wept. Very interesting, moving, nice, and I hope Remy will come back tonight when others decide to gather. But it looks like the weather was clear when he got there. Maybe people were still trying to piece together the puzzle and figure out exactly what it was that they would be mourning at that point. But hopefully a better turnout today. That is kind of strange all by itself. I'm not really sure how to react to that one. In the meantime, the other activities of the day yesterday, there were primary elections going on yesterday in various places, and the outcomes are encouraging in places, interesting, otherwise routine in others. Laura Clausen reporting over at Daily Kos on the front page earlier this morning. One of the outcomes that was a big deal for people everywhere. Missouri Medicaid expansion win. Missouri, the voters of Missouri voting to authorized expanded Medicaid coverage there. Will bring health coverage to 200,000 people. That's a nice thing. And you have to leave it to the voters to do because Republican politicians won't allow it to happen if it's left to them. And as a matter of fact, the story illustrated with a photo of the governor of Missouri, Mike Parson, looking unhappy with a caption that says he likely won't be happy once he finds out, the final news of what happened there. Missouri voters said yes to expanding Medicaid on Tuesday, despite the best efforts of Republicans, if you can call them best efforts, to block health care coverage for more than 200,000 people. Missouri has had an extremely low Medicaid eligibility threshold, with most non-disabled adults excluded from coverage. Even parents are only covered in cases of the most extreme poverty, less than $5,800 in income for a family of four in order to qualify. Wow, that's pretty crazy. Advocates for Medicaid expansion, many of whom had been working on the issue for years, celebrated Amendment 2 won today, according to Caitlin Adams, Executive Director of Missouri Jobs with Justice Voter Action. Because no matter what we look like, where we live, or how much money we make, most of us want the same things, the ability to keep our families safe and well. Expanding Medicaid is a big step toward this goal. Missouri's Republican Secretary of State and Governor had done their best to sink the effort by getting the measure on the primary ballot rather than waiting for the general election. Interesting. I wouldn't even have thought that was an option for you. Primaries are usually lower turnout elections that favor Republicans, but it didn't work, with cities voting strongly for expansion, rural areas voting strongly against, and suburbs tipping the result to yes. So again, eye on the suburbs there, folks. This makes 38 states, Laura notes, that have expanded Medicaid, including 6 red states where voters chose expansion through ballot measures. That's the only way it seems to happen. Organizers learned lessons from previous states. The ballot measure adds the Medicaid expansion into the state's constitution, effectively barring Republican lawmakers from adding conservative elements to the program, like work requirements and premiums, as other states sought to do following similar initiatives, Politico reports. Yet, there are 12 remaining states that haven't taken the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion, leaving many residents in the gap between qualifying for Medicaid and getting subsidies for private insurance, and those states aren't moving to do the right thing for their struggling families. Expanding Medicaid also reduces racial disparities in healthcare. For instance, Medicaid expansion has been associated with a reduction in disparities in key health outcomes such as infant mortality, a 14.5% decline for African Americans in expansion states versus a 6.6% decline for African Americans in non-expansion states. Some interesting detail here. And perforated appendix, really, that's a granular statistic, but okay. Significant reductions in perforated appendix admission rates for Hispanics, non-Hispanic blacks, and low-income communities. Missouri's government is now required to notify the federal government, if there's anybody at home, of its intent to expand Medicaid by March 1st and to actually do so by July. So, all right, some good news there. Other news out of the elections yesterday. I'm sure there are plenty of other reports here, but I'm going to scroll right down here looking for, it's right there. The Daily Kos Elections Morning Digest, actually, up next in my old style Daily Kos scroll. So let's go to that one because it's topped off by the one I had in mind here. Cori Bush, identified in the caption of her photo here, upset winner of the Democratic primary for Missouri's 1st congressional district. So we can go directly to that one, although good note, as always, right up at the top of the digest. Arizona, Kansas, Michigan, Missouri, and Washington all held primaries on Tuesday. So there's your answer if you were looking for the states to be listed off here. But first up, in a major upset in Missouri 01, nurse and activist Cori Bush defeated 10-term Representative William Lacey Clay in Tuesday's Democratic primary for Missouri's 1st congressional district. With 150,000 votes in, Bush led the incumbent 49-46. It's all over now, of course. Bush will be the overwhelming favorite in a November election in the St. Louis-based seat that backed Hillary Clinton 77-19. And so I guess you're looking at your next representative for Missouri's 1st District. A lot of old line folks, I guess, upset with that. William Lacey Clay, been around for quite some time, holds some fairly prominent positions on the committees. I saw some, I guess, rather conservative, well, and I should note, white Dems from outside of the area, as it turned out, complaining that this was a terrible thing to unseat a black politician growing in power in Washington. And, I mean, that's an argument to be made. But, there's obviously a flip side to the argument as well. I didn't follow the race closely enough to tell you who I should or shouldn't be favoring in the race, but it's an interesting development, not just because of unseating an incumbent, but and in a safe seat, so that it's not at all likely to flip red. That's just not going to happen. And so as the theory goes, that's where Democrats ought to be pushing for more progressive representation, where they won't lose the seat, where they don't run the risk of being, I don't know what, do we still call it red baiting, by the Republican opponent and seeing the seat flip. You should be putting forward your most progressive people there. I guess also of note, I saw discussed out there, and I guess, I suppose it's a point they discuss here in the digest. But apparently, Bush was one of the first of the candidates endorsed originally, I guess last time around, by the Justice Democrats organization, who many people, not all conservative-leaning Democrats, even plenty of middle-of-the-road Democrats and mainstream Democrats, have had a lot of negative things to say about, certainly about the track record of Justice Democrats. Justice Democrats very closely identified with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of course, whose own political operation, I think, has shown tremendous growth and promise, but the Justice Democrats, slate never really caught on. This is actually, I think, the first of the Justice Democrats endorsed candidates to actually win their primary at all, I guess. Certainly post 2018. I don't follow the development of the organization all that closely, but I've noted in passing that there's been a lot of derision about it, and that a lot of snide comments about how they haven't won anything in terms of primaries, or even when they did, I guess, in 2018, prior to that, to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's win, securing her actual general election win. They had won, obviously, a few primaries. I guess you have to count her as one of the Justice Democrat nominees, but they certainly hadn't won any other seats other than that. And I guess you're looking at the next one coming up, and that's got to be cause for celebration inside the organization anyway, and will serve to quiet, I suppose, some of their critics, although I assure you they'll find their ways to take their shots. Anyway, let's take a look at what the people who do know what they're talking about had to say over at the elections, the Daily Kos Elections Morning Digest. The race featured two strikingly different candidates. Clay's family had represented this district for over 50 years, while Bush only began her political career a few years ago. It started inauspiciously with a 2016 Senate bid that went nowhere and ended in a punishing 70-13 loss in the Democratic primary to National Party favorite Jason Kander. Kander went on, of course, to narrowly lose the general election, though I don't know, I didn't hear that many people saying, oh, well, we certainly would have won with Bush there instead, but maybe certainly a more modest goal in running for the House. And I think now, I guess we can say clearly more obtainable. 2 years later, Bush sought to challenge Clay but raised little money. However, she earned a prominent endorsement from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who earlier that summer had astonished the political world with her own victory against a longtime Democratic incumbent. While Bush didn't replicate AOC's success, Clay won by only a 57-37 margin, a fairly weak showing for a primary that suggested a significant number of voters were unhappy with the congressman. Bush soon sought a rematch, and this time the campaign far more competitive. She raised a credible amount of money and benefited from an almost $250,000 in outside spending from two connected groups, the Justice Democrats and Fight Corporate Monopolies. Sounds likely to be closely aligned to Justice Democrats. Clay seemed to belatedly recognize he was in some trouble and began running attack ads against Bush in the final week of the race, but according to Politico, the challenger and her allies outspent him badly on the airwaves during the stretch run. Bush argued during the campaign that Clay had not risen to meet the challenges of the moment in American history. Bush began making a name for herself through involvement in the 2014 protests against police brutality in Ferguson, which is located, of course, inside the 1st District, which, and as well as the demonstrations that broke out in the region this spring after the death of George Floyd. But the original Ferguson-based Black Lives Matter movement that grew out of Michael Brown's death. An activist of long standing there. Bush contrasted her record with Clay's, rhetorically asking, when we were getting our butts kicked and I was maced in the face in Florissant a few weeks ago and people were getting beat on by police officers, did he show up the next day and say, you can't do this in my district, you can't treat people this way? No. And that's going to be a pretty powerful message at the moment. So she's capitalized on it correctly here. Clay portrayed himself as a traditional workaday warrior for his constituents, a message he'd long relied on throughout his career. Not inaccurate either. But he also went much further. In pushing back against Bush, who, like him, is black, he claimed the easy racist way to lay it out is, look at Clay, what has he done for his district? I fight for that district every single day. Clay further denigrated the groups supporting Bush by claiming they were merely using her as a prop, insisting they use her to raise money to support their infrastructure. Ultimately, these attacks could not save Clay from his surprise defeat. His loss means that for the first time in 52 years, this area won't be represented by his clan. His father, Bill Clay, won a previous version of this seat back in 1968. He went on to become a founding member of the Congressional Black Caucus. The congressman retired in 2000, paving the way for his son, who decisively defeated St. Louis County Councilman Charlie Dooley in a 61-27 defeat in the primary to succeed the elder Clay for the 1st District. Clay faced no serious opposition for the renomination until 2012, when a new Republican-drawn congressional map led fellow Democratic Representative Russ Carnahan to run against him after Carnahan's old 3rd District was dismantled. The new seat, though, contained far more of Clay's constituents than Carnahan's, which gave Clay a huge advantage from the start. The new 1st District was also predominantly black. Carnahan was white, of course, and argued that he could represent the area's minority majority better than Clay could. A message that got him nowhere, as you might expect. Clay ended up winning by a decisive 63-34 and never faced another electoral threat until Bush. So there you go. Other primaries recapped here from Kansas. I mean, not the major focus of a show like ours necessarily, but in case you were wondering, there's no better place to go for the primary recap and elections news than the Morning Digest, of course. So let's see, what is a report out of Kansas's 2nd District here. So we'll say which ones were of interest. A Minnesota state court judge is interesting news from the election front, has approved a settlement between voting rights advocates and the Democratic Secretary of State Steve Simon for the November general election that will waive Minnesota's requirement that mail voters, M-A-I-L, in case you were wondering, voters by mail, have their ballots witnessed, and will also require that officials count any ballots postmarked by Election Day and received within a week. So expanding the time during which they can receive your ballot back. They'll be slow counting, not like Florida, where they insist on having received it by the day of the election and counting it right away. In June, the same judge signed off on a similar agreement for the state's August 11th primaries, so no surprise there. Let's see, other elections changes underway in New York, which, hey, that could be anything. They have complicated and convoluted election laws there. Some roundup of Senate polling. Greg likely would have covered all of this for us if he were able to be here with us today. He must be, well, he's not aching for a chance to be on the show because he's hearing how badly we're screwing it up today because he's got no internet. But wait till he finds out and then insists on repairing the damage. Hopefully he'll be in place for that for tomorrow. Let's see. Jeff Singer adding, by the way, additional coverage to that 1st District Missouri race. Missouri Progressive upsets 20-year congressman in Democratic primary in St. Louis. This was also illustrated with a fantastic shot of Cori Bush out on the streets, megaphone in hand, mask at the ready as well. So good news there. All right. Greg did manage to cobble together an abbreviated pundit roundup for this morning, so we could have just gone straight to that, of course. Let's see. I might as well open it up, and I'll scan it, of course, during the next break and see what else we can mine for additional stories, lest we miss anything important. But then, of course, if we do, Justice Putnam is here to bat cleanup for us in the program following, as usual. All right, let's see. Other things to add to the mix. Why not another disaster in the making, perhaps? Just by way of keeping an eye on the medical news. Tired of the pandemic? Tired of COVID-19? Tired of hearing that children aren't in danger from all of these things? Federal officials warn of a seasonal spike in a polio-like condition that mostly affects children. The kids felt left out, I guess, and this is an oddball sort of a thing. It's not a major emergency. The number of kids affected is extraordinarily small, but it's a real thing. And I guess the CDC felt like, well, you know, our reputation is pretty tarnished and trashed at this point. We might as well go forward with our normal warnings for things that people usually would ignore, and they might very well ignore in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we'll make sure we mention it. Lenny Bernstein covering it for the Washington Post. The CDC warned parents and caregivers Tuesday to watch out for an uncommon polio-like condition that mostly strikes children, usually between August and November. And, you know, Greg will tell you, well, it's serious and it's out there, I'm sure. But it's not going to be any sort of pandemic scale problem. But acute flaccid myelitis, do I have that right? Which may be caused by any of several viruses, is marked by a sudden weakness or paralysis of the limbs. Since surveillance began in 2014, prevalence of the syndrome has spiked in, this is the odd thing, even-numbered years, often afflicting children about 5 years old. And I'd love to have an explanation for how it seems to spike in even-numbered years versus, you know, I'm sure the dynamics of the virus can explain it somewhere, but which virus is it that even causes it? I don't think that they've even nailed that down. They've sort of discussed it in terms of a small array of viruses that might be responsible. The disease is very rare, but a quick response is critical once the weakness sets in. The disease can progress over hours or days and lead to permanent paralysis or respiratory failure, according to CDC reports. Among 238 cases in 2018 that were reviewed by the CDC, you can see a small scale here, but it's worrisome. 98% of patients were hospitalized, 54% required intensive care, 23% were placed on ventilators to help them breathe. Bad time to be in need of a ventilator right now. Most patients were hospitalized within a day of experiencing the weakness, but only about 10% were not hospitalized until 4 or more days later, possibly because of failure to recognize the syndrome, the report said. So I guess the chief takeaway from here is be aware that there is such a thing if you have a child around the age of 5 under your care. Be aware of the possibility that if they're complaining of that sort of muscle pain and weakness, and I guess certainly if you're seeing paralysis setting in, that would be an alarm for you. But that there is such a thing, and that you ought to get yourself and the child to the hospital early. I guess that's the role of the CDC on normal times, just putting out those warnings just in case, and you find yourself visiting the doctor and describing these symptoms. The doctor will have read. The doctor reads the manuals and reads the books, and he'll know what to do, even if it's not a he. It's true. A number of viruses it does mention down here, including West Nile virus, adenovirus, and non-polio enteroviruses, are known to produce the symptoms in a small number of people who become infected by those pathogens. But enterovirus, particularly one dubbed EVD68, appears to be the most common cause. You don't have to write that down. The doctors may opt to tell you, but quite honestly, they'll just move directly to treatment. And interestingly, unclear, of course, whether mask wearing, social distancing, or any other measures that have been taken against the coronavirus would limit the outbreak of acute flaccid myelitis expected this year. But if, I guess, Australia is any indication, not that they have this problem that I know of in Australia, but the Australian flu season, remember their seasons are reversed from ours, has been dramatically less impactful this year. Largely, I think, they say, because of the measures people are taking against the spread of the coronavirus. Hand washing, something we're always encouraged to do in flu season, but rarely abide by with the same fervor as we are now for COVID-19. Plus, of course, the social distancing and mask wearing. You would think it would cut down on transmission of the flu. And the good news is, as people were dreading the confluence of the flu season and a second wave of COVID-19, flu virulency way down in Australia. Good news. Hope we can do it too. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. One other item I should note from the electoral front. I did... now I don't know what to do with it, because the tweet I was relying on to report the news to you has disappeared, which, of course, only worries me that maybe the news was premature and didn't work out and isn't true. So I guess we'll skip that one for now. And, wow, okay. Let's see, other items up for discussion. We still have some items from Greg's Roundup, although I wonder whether he was planning, if he manages to make it back on the air tomorrow, to handle these stories tomorrow. And then what would happen if we left him without things to discuss? So, well, we'll cover some of them, and we'll leave the intricate polling stories, at least, which are usually some of his favorite, for his own discussion. Here's a quick-ish item. I don't know. Is there maybe there's a longer piece attached to it, but I happened to catch this tweet. David Greiner, not a name I think we've called here before, creative and innovation editor at Adweek. I'm pretty sure we haven't landed on his feed before, but he made an interesting point here. Yes, and there is a link, so perhaps we'll dive into the story here. He says, I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. And the link is to Current Affairs. It's not something else we've landed on either. What it describes itself, the magazine for moms. Is that serious? Can you really live with that tagline at this point? Nathan J. Robinson, the writer of the piece here, very interesting. Greiner chooses two screen grabs to summarize the whole thing, and perhaps that's, I don't know, is that the better approach? How long is this article? Although it does sound like the sort of thing that we might find very interesting. Let's explore it. Why don't we? Here's the headline, and what made David Greiner say, I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. The headline is, "The truth is paywalled, but the lies are free. And then subheader, the political economy of, well, you know the word. We say it as BS here, although we always let Greg get away with saying the right thing too, because I think at some point we found out that under the right circumstances, the FCC, which has no jurisdiction here over our program, allows it on the air when necessary. The truth is paywall, but the lies are free. The political economy of bullshit. How do you like that? Nathan J. Robinson, I think, has hit on something fairly serious here. Paywalls, pardon me. Wow. Paywalls are justified, even though they are annoying. I think that's a fair statement. It costs money to produce good writing, to run a website, to license photographs. A lot of money if you want quality. Asking people for a fee to access content is therefore very reasonable. You don't expect to get a print subscription to the newspaper gratis. Why would a website be different? I try not to grumble about having to pay for online content because I run a magazine and I know how difficult it is to pay writers what they deserve. But let's also notice something. The New York Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, the New Republic, New York, Harper's, the New York Review of Books. This is a very New York heavy list here. The Financial Times and the London Times all have paywalls. Breitbart, Fox News, the Daily Wire, the Federalist, the Washington Examiner, InfoWars, free. If you want the headline, Portland protesters burn Bibles and American flags in the streets, or the moral case against mask mandates and other COVID restrictions, or an article suggesting the National Institutes of Health has admitted 5G phones cause coronavirus, they're yours. You want the detailed Times report on neo-Nazis infiltrating German institutions? Haven't gotten to that one yet. And the reasons contact tracing is failing in the U.S., or the Trump administration's undercutting of the Postal Service's effectiveness. Well, if you've clicked around the website a bit, you'll run straight into a paywall. This doesn't mean the paywall shouldn't be there, but it does mean that it costs time and money to access a lot of true and important information, while a lot of bullshit is completely free. Now, crucially, I do not mean to imply here that reading the New York Times gives you a sound grasp of reality. I have documented many times how the Times misleads people, for instance, by repeating the dubious idea that we have a border crisis of migrants pouring into the country, or that Russia is trying to steal life-saving vaccine research. That's an interesting angle on that. That should be free anyway, if they're trying to produce the vaccine, which I'm not certain that they are. But it's important to understand the problem with the Times. It is not that the facts it reports tend to be inaccurate, though sometimes they are, but that the facts are presented in a way that misleads. There is no single fact in the migrant story or the Russia story that I take issue with. What I take issue with is the conclusions that are being drawn from the facts. Likewise, the headline, U.S. says Hussein intensifies quest for A-bomb parts, is technically accurate. The U.S. government did in fact say that. It was just not true. The New York Times is, in fact, extremely valuable if you read it critically and look past the headlines. That's kind of what we try to do with it here. Usually the truth is in there somewhere, and there is a great deal of excellent reporting, and one could almost construct a serious newspaper purely from the material culled from the New York Times. I've written before about the Times' reporting on Hitler and the Holocaust. It wasn't that the grim facts of the situation were left out of the paper, but that they were buried at the back and treated as unimportant. It was changes in emphasis that were needed because the facts were there in black and white. This means that a lot of the most vital information will end up locked behind the paywall. And while I am not much of a New Yorker fan either, it's concerning that the Hoover Institute will freely give you Richard Epstein's infamous article downplaying the threat of coronavirus, but Isaac Chotner's interview demolishing Epstein requires a monthly subscription, meaning that the lie is more accessible than its refutation. Eric Levitz of New York is one of the best and most prolific left political commentators we have. But unless you're a subscriber of New York, you won't get to hear much of what he has to say each month. Possibly even worse is the fact that so much academic writing is kept behind vastly more costly paywalls. A white supremacist on YouTube will tell you all about race and IQ. But if you want to read a careful scholarly refutation, obtaining a legal PDF from the journal publisher would cost you $14.95, a price nobody in their right mind would pay for one article if they can't get institutional access. I recently gave up on trying to access a scholarly article because I could not find a way to get it for less than $39.95, though in that case the article was garbage rather than gold. And he links to it in case you want to see which one it is. Academic publishing is a nightmarish patchwork with lots of articles advertised at exorbitant fees on one site and then for free on another, or accessible only through certain databases which your university or public library may or may not have access to. Libraries have to budget carefully because subscription prices are often nuts. A library subscription to the Journal of Coordination Chemistry, for instance, not that you would necessarily need it, but let's say you did, costs $11,367 annually. Wow. That's obviously a journal that no one is paying for themselves individually. They just pass on the bill to an institution and they figure they can get away with that. And I guess there's just not enough of them to lower the price. Of course, people can find their ways around paywalls. Sci-Hub, like science, Sci-Hub is a completely illegal but extremely convenient means of obtaining academic research for free. I am purely describing it, not advocating it, he says parenthetically. You can find a free version of the article debunking race and IQ myths on ResearchGate, a site that has engaged in mass copyright infringement in order to make research accessible, that's the term he uses here, often because journal publishers tightly control access to their copyrighted work in order to charge those exorbitant fees for PDFs. The versions of articles that you can get for free are drafts that have not yet gone through peer review and have thus been subjected to less scrutiny. This means that the more reliable an article is, the less accessible it is. On the other hand, pseudo-scholarship is easy to find. Right-wing think tanks like the Cato Institute, the Foundation for Economic Education, the Hoover Institution, the Mackinac Center, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Heritage Foundation pump out slickly produced policy documents on every subject under the sun. They are utterly untrustworthy. The conclusion is always going to be, let the free market handle the problem, no matter what the problem or the facts of the case. But it is often dressed up to look sober-minded and non-ideological. It's not easy or cheap to be an independent researcher. When I was writing my first book, Super Predator, I wanted to look through newspaper, magazine, and journal archives to find everything I could about Bill Clinton's record on race. I was lucky I had a university affiliation because this gave me access to databases like LexisNexis. If I hadn't, the cost of finding out what I wanted to find out would likely have run into the thousands of dollars. A problem beyond cost, though, is convenience. I find that even when I'm doing research through databases in my university library, it often is an absolute mess. The sites are clunky and constantly demanding login credentials. The amount of time wasted in figuring out how to obtain a piece of research material is a massive cost on top of the actual pricing. The federal court document database Pacer, for instance, charges 10 cents a page for access to records, which adds up quickly since legal research often involves looking through thousands of pages. Well, of course, if you're an institution hiring your lawyer, you'll get billed for that. Individual, too, of course, but not always as easy to pay when you're an individual. They offer an exemption if you're a researcher or can't afford it, but to get the exemption, you have to fill out a 3-page form and provide an explanation of both why you need each document and why you deserve the exemption. This is a waste of time that inhibits people's productivity and limits their access to knowledge. In fact, to see just how much human potential is being squandered by having knowledge dispensed by the free market, let us briefly picture what totally democratic and accessible knowledge would look like. Let's imagine that instead of having to use privatized research services like Google Scholar and EBSCO, E-B-S-C-O, there was a single public search database containing every newspaper article, every magazine article, every academic journal article, every court record, every government document, every website, every piece of software, every film, song, photograph, television show, and video clip, and every book in existence. The content of the Wayback Machine, of all of the newspaper archives, Google Books, Getty Images, Project Gutenberg, Spotify, the Library of Congress, everything in Westlaw and Nexus, all of it, every piece of it accessible instantly in full and with a search function designed to be as simple as possible and allow you to quickly narrow down what you're looking for. For example, give me all Massachusetts newspaper articles, books published in Boston, and government documents that mention William Lloyd Garrison and were published from 1860 to 1865. That would be a rather specific request. The true universal search, uncorrupted by paid advertising. Within a second, you could bring up an entire PDF of any book. Within 2 seconds, you could search the full contents of that book. Let us imagine just how much time would be saved in this informational utopia. Do I want minute 15 of the 1962 Czechoslovak film Man in Outer Space? I don't. Do you? 4 seconds from my thought until it begins. This is a nice fantasy anyway. Where does it go? We'll find out. Do I want page 17 of the Daily Mirror from 1985? Even less time. Every public defense department document concerning Vietnam from the Eisenhower administration. Page 150 of Frank Capra's autobiography. I get the idea here. Why are we going on with this? I don't know. Page 400 of an economics textbook from 1995. All in front of me in full in less than the length of time it takes to type this sentence, which is very long, actually. How much faster would research be in such a situation? Much faster. How much more could be accomplished if knowledge were not fragmented and in the possession of thousands of private gatekeepers? I get it. What's amazing is that the difficulty of creating this situation of fully democratized information is entirely economic rather than technological. What I described with books is close to what Google Books and Amazon already have, but of course, universal free access to full content horrifies publishers, so we are prohibited from using those systems to their full potential. The problem is ownership. Nobody is allowed to build a giant free database of everything human beings have ever produced. Getty Image will sue sue the crap out of you. Well, unless there's a bull in front of it, we can't say it. We can, but we don't. My stupid scruples getting in the way. Getty Images will sue the crap out of you if you take a historical picture from their archive and violate your licensing agreement with them. Same with the Walt Disney Company if you create a free rival to Disney Plus with all of their movies. Sci-Hub was founded in Kazakhstan because if you founded it here, they would swiftly put you in federal prison. When you really think about what it means, copyright law is an unbelievably intensive restriction on freedom of speech, sharply delineating the boundaries of what information can and cannot be shared with other people. But it's not just profiteering companies that will fight to the death to keep content safely locked up. The creators of content are horrified by piracy too. You understand why. As my colleagues Lita Gold and Brianna Renix write, writers, artists, and filmmakers can be justifiably concerned that unless ideas and writings and images can be regarded as property, they will starve to death. That is serious. Is there a justifiable rationale for treating ideas and particularly stories as a form of property? They write, one obvious reason for doing so is to ensure that writers and other creators don't starve to death. In our present-day capitalist utopia, if a writer's output can be brazenly copied and profited upon by others, they won't have any meaningful ability to make a living off their work, especially if they're an independent creator without any kind of institutional affiliation or pre-existing wealth. Lita and Brianna point out that in the real world, this justification is often bullshit, we get to say it that way, because copyrights last well beyond the death of the person who actually made the thing. But it's a genuine worry because there is no universal basic income for a writer to fall back on in this country if their works are simply passed around from hand to hand without anybody paying for them. I admit I bristle when I see people share PDFs of full issues of Current Affairs. his publication. Because if this happened a lot, we could sell exactly one subscription and then the issue could be just copied indefinitely. Current affairs would collapse completely if everyone tried to get our content for free rather than paying for it. I just did. This is why you should subscribe or donate. Independent media needs your support. Hey, we do too. What the hell? Okay. At the end of last year, I published a book on socialism. And at first, some conservatives thought it funny to ask me, if you're a socialist, can I have it for free? They were quieted, though, when I pointed out that, yes, they could indeed have it for free. All they needed to do was go to the local socialized information repository known as the public library, where they would be handed a copy of the book without having to fork over a nickel. Anyone who wants to read my book but cannot or does not want to pay for it has an easy solution. I realized, though, as I was recommending everyone get my book from the library rather than buying it in a bookstore, that my publisher probably didn't appreciate my handing out this advice, and frankly, it made me a little nervous. I depend for my living on my writing, so if everyone got my book from the library, it wouldn't sell any copies, except to the libraries, and then my publisher wouldn't pay me to write any more books. We can't have too many people using the socialized information repository when authors are reliant on a capitalist publishing industry. In fact, a strange thing about the library is that we intentionally preserve an unnecessary inefficiency in order to keep the current content financing model afloat. Your library could just give you DRM-free PDFs of my book and every issue of Current Affairs for free, but instead they make you go to the magazine room or check out one of a limited numbers of copies of the book, because while we want books and magazines to be free, we cannot have them be as free as it is possible to make them, or it would hurt the publishing industry too much. Libraries preserve the fiction that there are a select number of copies available of a digital book, even though this is ludicrous because abandoning the fiction would hurt publishers. They could offer every book written to anyone at any time, they just can't do it legally. I also realized, however, that I wouldn't care how many people got my book for free if my compensation operated on a different structure, where I was paid by the number of people who read it rather than the number of people who bought it. Impossible, you say. Where would the money come from? We can imagine such a setup quite easily, though. We have our universal public knowledge database, and anyone who wants to can type in the title of any of my books and read them for free. Double asterisk to that there, it says. But the number of people who read the book is tracked, and I'm compensated $2 for every person who reads it. A pittance, but that's about what authors get for their sales. Current Affairs, likewise, is granted a budget proportional to its readership. Compensated from where? Budget from where? Why, from the Universal Public Knowledge Database, of course, but from where do they get their money? Why, from taxes, asterisk. Free at point of use services are not some alien concept. Oh? The NHS compensates doctors while charging patients nothing. Of course, compensation for producers wouldn't even be that much of an issue in a society with a universal basic income and where the basics of life were guaranteed. I wouldn't care about making any money on my books if I could live decently regardless. Now, I'm sure there will be some who argue that any universal knowledge access system of this kind will inhibit the creation of work by reducing the rewards people get. But let's note a few facts. This has become rather interesting, but it has departed rather significantly from the main and, I thought, most interesting point that the good content is paid and behind a paywall, and the crap is available for free. I think actually at this part we'll probably pause on this one. This has become very interesting, the idea of trying to construct this utopian universal access to knowledge and a concurrent system of universal basic income. And it's worth exploring, but maybe not with the rest of our time on today's show. I just thought that was I thought it was going to be more about the concept of and the dangers, the immediate dangers of leaving the BS information out there for free while the quality information was difficult to get and costly. That was, in fact, the best point. We probably should have taken David Griner's instant summary with the 2 screenshots as the best and most salient point that this article had to offer. though I thought that we might be selling it short if we did that. And we were, but that doesn't mean it isn't a good thing to do. We'll go on from there. Let's see, a comment here. Have we got something here? John Ronald here noting from yesterday's episode, minor cultural note. Always good to fit a cultural note in here. We'll see. The suffix kun, K-U-N, is a Japanese honorific affixed to the last names of Japanese teen boys who don't yet merit the more formal san. It's usually anime nerds, I am one, who pick up on it. Yes, okay. Now I need to pick up on, what did we do yesterday? I don't think I actually, Well, remind me, John, if you would, what the hell were we talking about? I read these things. We go through a story, and I often have no memory of what it was I spoke about. That's why I need to have Scott do the summaries of each day's show. I have a list of the links that I use and some memory, a little bit, of what it was that we talked about, but usually can't produce the details for it. Oh, that's interesting. So those of you, I guess the other anime nerds out there might have noticed the same thing. I guess you're not alone, but you don't have me as company in terms of remembering what the hell we were doing using Japanese suffixes yesterday. But sounds interesting. Sounds like a story I'd like to hear about, even though I guess I read it. I'll have to go back and take a look. All right, let's jump on to another couple stories of interest. I thought this was one, and I can throw this together with another piece that I know I have here in pocket as well, on back to COVID-19 and back to Sweden. Bloomberg, Lionel Laurent with this piece, good COVID-19 news from Italy and Sweden. Sweden could really use some good COVID-19 news. The situation continues to deteriorate there, although they have definitely slowed the growth and spread of their virus, but they took such a huge impact early on, they still end up listed on the top 10 lists nightly as I'm putting together the deaths per million in population, not as Donald Trump would have deaths per COVID patient identified. Although I've been thinking about taking a look at the way that statistic, what would that statistic look like if you calculated it out for all the countries in the world? And would the United States, in fact, be doing all that well? I'm not so sure that that's the case. All right, anyway, the good news from Italy and Sweden, we could use some. The country's policies for taming the outbreak couldn't have been more different, but their current success in avoiding a resurgence should be heeded. And I guess this is relevant to that part of the Axios interview in which Trump insisted that the rest of the world was in fact having a resurgence of the disease, whereas we weren't. We were just on the same straight up trajectory of our first wave here. I don't know why he thought that was such good news. The lifting of COVID-19 lockdowns around the world was never going to be easy, but as infections are flaring up from Spain, that was another one that Trump pointed to, and that's true, to Australia, where there is a flare-up, but it's extraordinarily small, but they're treating it very seriously. Very big difference from the way we're doing things here. It's worth noting that two of the hardest-hit countries at the pandemic's peak, Italy and Sweden, are keeping the virus's spread under control. Daily confirmed cases in both nations are now averaging at around 200 each, well below their respective peaks, with no rebound in sight and no strain on hospitals. By contrast, the daily case count in Spain rose past 2,000 last week, and France's surpassed 1,000. This is by no means a second wave, but it's worth asking what Italy and Sweden might be doing differently to manage the virus. These countries once stood out for the wrong reasons. Italy was the first European country hit by a COVID-19 surge and the first to impose a draconian lockdown. Sweden took a more liberal and controversial approach at odds with other Nordic countries that kept schools, some anyway, open and broadly stuck to recommendations on social distancing and self-isolation rather than forced quarantine. While Italy's lockdown arguably saved lives, it came late. Sweden's, meanwhile, never came at all, And on a per capita basis, Italy's death toll of more than 35,154 comes out to about 600 per 1 million people, as does Sweden's 5,743 deaths, distributed there only among 10 million people, not 60-something million as it is in Italy. While Italy, in the current post-peak phase, still, with Italy gradually reopening its economy and Sweden maintaining its policy, both countries seem to have found their stride in living with the virus. In Italy, top-down public health management of life after lockdown seems to be winning the day. As in other countries, social distancing rules require people to keep 1 meter apart, not 2, like we do here, but 1 meter apart. We'll return to this story after a quick break and find out what's up after this. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take, or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. I'm just scanning here. This is going to take a little while longer than I thought to find the other Sweden-related article that I wanted to follow up this piece with. I guess it's more buried than I thought. Okay. Well, no, that seems like that wasn't it either. All right, well, at any rate, I think, you know what, it must be, as I recall now, it was in one of those, there we are, that shows up in Pocket without a picture. But let's go back now to the Bloomberg piece that we were reading about what's up these days in Italy and Sweden. Italy maintaining their social distancing rules, but at 1 meter, basically 3 feet apart rather than 6, which is interesting, and having people wear face masks in public indoor spaces or on public transit. But there's a particularly high level of enforcement and rigor. So maybe that's it. We need 6 feet because we're terrible at it. They only need 3 feet because they're pretty good at it. Taking a train or going into an office building in Italy involves having your temperature checked. Going out to dinner means giving the restaurant your full contact details to ensure a potential infection transmission can be traced. Special forms must be filled in for access to tourist hotspots like Sardinia, Sicily, and Puglia. Is that how they pronounce it? Puglia? Okay, well, we'll check our Italian later. In the northern region of Lombardy, the country's original epicenter, masks have even been required outdoors. Breaking COVID-19 quarantine is a crime nationwide, with possible sanctions including fines or jail time. The effectiveness of these rules is a testament to people's willingness and ability to follow them, says Rosanna Tarracone, associate professor in healthcare management at Bocconi University. Oh boy, I'm probably mangling all of the Italian here today. Regulations extend to how people dance in a nightclub or sunbathe on the beach. Without some level of buy-in, they wouldn't get very far. Memories of the harrowing scenes as hospitals were overloaded with COVID-19 patients are also a motivator. There's a feeling of collective responsibility mixed in with fear. If the lesson from Italy is that bureaucracy, enforcement, and obedience are key to controlling COVID-19 outbreaks, Sweden appears contradictory at first glance. After much hesitation and questioning of its hands-off approach, especially after a grim death toll in nursing homes and the continued rise in infections in June, the country has stuck to it. There's no mandatory mask wearing in Sweden. Social distancing is recommended rather than enforced, and people are generally advised to stay home if they're feeling unwell. That the country's curve has flattened will no doubt comfort anti-lockdown protesters in the U.S. who once exhorted, "Be more like Sweden." But that would miss the point. Swedes haven't benefited from simply letting the virus rip. Their immunity levels are still low, antibody tests indicate, and they aren't being told to throw caution to the wind. Behavioral changes have taken place. The flow of human traffic is still not back to normal in many areas, according to Google mobility data, and officials have regularly warned people that failure to respect social distancing would lead to tougher rules. Some rules have been tightened, from a ban on visits to elderly care homes to the shutdown of restaurants in Stockholm that weren't following guidelines. Social distancing is paying off. This isn't a model that can be easily reproduced elsewhere. Swedes are young, their country is sparsely populated, and a high proportion already live relatively isolated lives by working from home in single-occupancy households. But the secret here might be consistency. That's a key component for ensuring COVID-19 policies are sustainable in the long run, according to Italian academic Giuliano de Baldassare, a professor of crisis management at Sweden's Uppsala University. Oh, haven't we hit on this before? Unless there are more. But this rings a bell, right? An Italian professor at Sweden's Uppsala University. If the aim is to live with the virus until a treatment or vaccine is found, a stop-and-go approach to rules, such as the flip-flops most everywhere on whether face masks should be worn and where, might be counterproductive and make them impossible to enforce. So, while Italy shows that alertness and intervention pay off, Sweden is a reminder that this is a marathon more than a sprint. There's no quick fix or perfect template for COVID-19, and everyone makes mistakes. Italy's closure of schools came with a huge cost that brought little benefit, while Sweden's botched handling of care homes for the elderly probably led to deaths that could have been avoided. But as we move into a new phase of this pandemic, the two countries are clearly worth watching. And we'll have nothing else to do but watch them, because we can't seem to shake this virus here in the United States. Not so sure about the conclusion that Italy's closure of schools came with a huge cost and little benefit. That seems backwards to me. We still have people, of course, here in the United States insisting kids don't get it. But kids weren't getting it because kids weren't gathering. They were staying home. So I'm not so sure that it's necessarily a thing that doesn't affect kids so much as we took kids out of circulation. While they're back in circulation, they seem to be getting it just fine. Anyway, I did have another piece of some interest here in an academic sort of journal, or a trade journal, Globalization and Health, which maybe we're just best off just sort of reading the abstract and background of this academic paper, but it touched on the same subject area: misinformation and decontextualization, international media reporting on Sweden and COVID-19. Author here is Rachel Elizabeth Irwin, and I'm not certain where in this layout of this article they'll identify her and who she is, but I assume it's somewhere. Here we are. Irwin, this is just the citation for the article. Interesting that this doesn't make it immediately and clearly available up front. How odd. Anyway, I thought, I forget how I stumbled upon this, but I think I was just sort of looking at how I was trying, I think, to look at how the Swedish local press, the Swedish language press, was discussing their own public opinion conclusions about how they had done in treating the virus and dealing with it. And while the rest of the world was pointing to Sweden and saying, look at this example, shouldn't we be following this example? And others, of course, pointing and saying, yeah, but their death rate is tremendous. Yes, but you can get a haircut and go to a restaurant. See. So it's all worth it, right? But I was wondering, how were Swedes reading about this in their own press, and how did they feel about it? If you ask people on the ground in Sweden, would you get the same answer? And I think that's how I hit upon this particular piece here. The abstract reads this way: in the first month of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, Sweden took the same strategy as most other countries, working to flatten the curve by slowing transmission so that the healthcare system could cope with the disease. However, unlike most other countries, much of Sweden's implementation focused on voluntary and stepwise action rather than legislation and compulsory measures, leading to considerable attention in the international media. And there, I think, a good and key point made rather efficiently in just one paragraph. Sweden's strategy, looked at in a certain light, was in fact the same as most other countries. It wasn't really so much of an outlier. The strategy was to flatten the curve. They validated the flatten the curve. I don't see how you could avoid validating the flatten the curve approach. It was just that their approach to flattening the curve was different, and I guess the idea was that it would be individually tailored to the specific nature of the Swedish population. That it wasn't ever held up, certainly not by Swedish authorities, as the model which other countries should follow. It was, I think, regarded as uniquely suited to Sweden more than anything else. And yet, of course, basically all people in the United States saw was, well, they can go to their restaurants and they seem to be out and having a good time, and I want to be doing that, and why can't we implement the Swedish model here? Well, because you're not Sweden, that's why. 6 main narratives emerged in the international media reporting on Sweden during the first month of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ready? 1, life is normal in Sweden. 2, Sweden has a herd immunity strategy. 3, Sweden is not following expert advice. 4, Sweden is not following WHO recommendations. 5, the Swedish approach is failing. And 6, Swedes trust the government. While these narratives are partially grounded in reality, in some media outlets, the language and examples used to frame the story distorted the accuracy of the reporting. I can't believe that would happen. But it did. This debate examines the way in which international media, I gather they're largely concentrating on American here, but we'll see, both constructs and represents a pandemic, and the implications for how researchers engage with news and social media. Cross-country comparison and the sharing of best practice are reliant on accurate information. The Swedish example underlines the importance of fact-checking and source critique, and for the need for precision when presenting data and statistics. It also highlights limitations of using culture as an explanation for behavior and the pitfalls of evaluating policy during a pandemic. Interesting, too. Maybe we can read through the background here as well. During the early stages of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, many governments and public health experts were focused on finding best practices in controlling the spread of the disease. Fact-checking, source critique, and precision in how data and statistics are presented are necessary preconditions for the sharing of cross-border experiences. As researchers, we are also part of the media. We may be interviewed. We write opinion pieces, and we share news on social media. We are reliant upon accurate information, and we also have a responsibility for how we engage with the media. Using the example of international reporting on Sweden's COVID-19 response, in this debate I examine the ways in which the international media both constructs and represents a pandemic. One issue was that much of the media reporting was not fully accurate, hindering an in-depth discussion of best practice. Media reporting is also often at a superficial level and does not allow space for the details of policies or consideration of regional or local experiences. While there was a desire for facts and evidence, the frantic search for best practice also led some to draw premature conclusions. All of this misleading media coverage led to wasted time. Swedish representatives were forced to put significant energy into combating misinformation rather than dealing with domestic challenges. A second issue was over the use of culture as an explanation for policy choices. Culture and context certainly play a role in any country's response, yet a focus on culture can lead other countries to dismiss the lessons learned from cultures that are seemingly unlike their own. A focus on culture can also lead to the exotification or simplification of a country's response. Feels like Sweden did get the short end of that stick. This article examines the first month of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. Sweden took the same strategy as most other countries, working to flatten the curve by slowing transmission so that the healthcare system could cope with the disease. However, unlike most other countries, much of Sweden's implementation focused on voluntary and stepwise action. We learned about that. This led to considerable attention in the international media, with the response gaining the moniker the Swedish experiment. The suggestion that Sweden's laissez-faire response was synonymous with inaction became problematic enough for the foreign minister to dispute this on CNN. In the book Good Sweden, Bad Sweden, journalist Paul Rapaccioli, I'm not certain how you would pronounce it, Rapacioli, describes how Sweden and Swedish values have been used as a weapon in a post-truth world. Relatively few people have first-hand knowledge or experience within the country, or with the country rather, and what they know tends to be positive and associated with so-called progressive values such as innovation, democracy, environmental concern, and feminism. Sweden also ranks highly on most league tables. I couldn't tell you what that means, actually. The next sentence begins, this means that negative stories are tantalizing. That's not actually what league tables means. Negative stories are tantalizing as they provide an exciting juxtaposition to the lazy myth that Sweden is some kind of paradise rather than a many-layered country of 10 million people. Moreover, changes in how news is produced, circulated, and consumed have also given rise to misinformation, disinformation, and even so-called fake news. Rapaccioli was writing in the context of the migrant debate, which characterized much of the 2010s, arguing that the far right was seeking to undermine progressive values by using selective reporting to prove that migration was destroying Sweden. I remember that was the case. Interesting. And Good Sweden, Bad Sweden is a great title for that book because it struck me that conservatives here during the COVID pandemic were saying, why aren't we more like Sweden? Sweden has the right model for us. We should be following Sweden's path. And it was just a matter of months since they were saying, whatever we do, we can't be like Sweden, where Malmo has become a completely like a Middle Eastern bazaar. There's no-go zones in the whole city. That Sweden had it all wrong on immigration, but somehow all right on COVID-19. That was odd. In international media, Sweden is often discussed as a peculiar country in the north where everything is either perfect paradise or a collapsing hellhole. While the context of COVID-19 is different, many of the same mechanisms are at work here. This polarized view of Sweden is exemplified by two articles. 3 days before The Guardian reported that Swedish PM warned over Russian roulette-style COVID-19 strategy, it had published a story covering southern Sweden's emerging wine industry. In the media reporting of the Swedish experiment, 6 main narratives emerged. We went through them before, which I discuss in the sections that follow. And then it gets into the lengthy academic discussion of the whole thing. But we'll leave off by having read the abstract in the background. Those of you who have the time to sort through this, it is a very interesting discussion, point by point, about these things. And remember, maybe we'll read narrative 1 here, that life is normal in Sweden. I'd like to see what the critique of that is. And it starts with a excerpt from another publication here. While Sweden's fellow Scandinavians and nearly all other Europeans are spending most of their time holed up at home under orders from their governments, Swedes last weekend still enjoyed the springtime sun, sitting in cafes and munching pickled herrings in restaurants. And quite frankly, if we were munching pickled herrings here, I wouldn't be missing restaurants all that much either. But like we said, culture. which they're trying to tamp down on culture as an explanation. But maybe that was what they meant by it. We should adopt the Swedish model. All restaurants should serve pickled herring, and then Americans would stay out of it voluntarily. That's a possibility, I guess, except for the Minnesotans, where Swedish... anyway, Swedish borders are open, they point out, although only to European economic area nationals, as are cinemas, that's interesting, gyms, pubs, and schools for those under 16. International reporting painted a picture of Swedes eating at outdoor cafes and strolling in the sunshine, or even skiing. Trains and buses were still shuttling people all over the country, and cinemas were open. Sweden also kept domestic flights going, despite the risk of spreading the coronavirus. On the 9th of April, Vox reported that for months the Scandinavian nation allowed large gatherings to form, schools for younger children to remain open, restaurants to serve late-night guests, and resorts to welcome thrill-seeking skiers. Well, the Vox article was striking, claiming that for months Sweden had been acting normally. Yet it was published less than a month after the World Health Organization had characterized COVID-19 as a pandemic, so most other countries had also been acting normal for months. One of the first English language articles to break the Swedish story was the aforementioned Swedish PM warned over Russian roulette-style COVID-19 strategy article. An early published version of the article stated that the Prime Minister, in a speech the night before, had, quote, urged Swedes to lunch at a local restaurant. The text was later changed. Stefan Löfven, or Löfven, it's a umlaut over the O. Stefan Löfven, in fact, had specified a takeaway lunch during a speech broadcast on the 22nd of March. So again, the Prime Minister is telling everybody to eat lunch at a local restaurant. He was saying, get takeout, which is what we do here. The narrative of Sweden as normal was misleading. The bulk of international media reporting focused on Stockholm, and most online videos showed the area around, should I even try it? Kungsträdgården. Okay, well, around one of the nice parks there. But don't ask me to read the Swedish. Will only be disastrous. But around these two very nice city center areas, there was some truth to this narrative. During the second full week of April, it had been widely reported in national media that Stockholmers were pushing the limits of good advice by sitting in crowded outdoor seating areas. The city of Stockholm responded by carrying out extra checks on restaurants and cafes over the Easter weekend. However, central Stockholm is not representative of Sweden. And even when it's just Stockholm as itself, as they point out here, the reaction in Stockholm from the authorities was not, okay, that's fine. It was, no, we need to do something about this. The main cinema chain in Sweden, Filmstaden, don't know where the emphasis belongs, closed on 17th of March. So few people were attending the cinema when these articles were written. So just flat wrong, right? After much discussion, Ski Star, the country's main ski operator, decided to close its facilities on the 6th of April. Ski gondolas were already closed on the 24th of March. Sweden's decision to keep a select few flights open was due to their designation as societally important routes. Visby is the main city on Gotland, an island. Kiruna is above the polar circle, and other cities, more pronunciation, Luleå, Umeå, Östersund. What do I need to do to try to get these right? Let me just tell you. Let's see, they named specifically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 northern cities, all which they point out, also because they're in the north and relatively remote. The point here is, not that I can't read Swedish, but that the government decided that flights needed to run, not for tourists to shuttle them around to different parts of the country, but to ensure that essential supplies and workers could reach these cities. And yet we had casually taken that to mean Sweden's open for business as usual and everything is normal. The flights continue. The restaurants are open. The ski areas are open. The cinemas are open. They are not, or they weren't for very long after these articles were published anyway. The wider picture, Sweden as normal, was misleading because life was not normal. CNBC reported on a report, that's what it says, released by Swedbank, that forecast the economy would contract by 4% and that unemployment would reach 10% by the summer. Already during the course of March 2020, the numbers of businesses going into administration, their version of bankruptcy, had increased, with the hospitality industry seeing an increase of 1,400%. Stockholmers drinking in the sun should not symbolize the various Swedish COVID-19 experiences. Very interesting. The second section is about Sweden pursuing a herd immunity strategy. And we've already heard, no pun intended, that it's claimed that was never the case. And I can see the picture emerging from this style of reporting on the reportage that likely was just a misconception too, and just a lazy conclusion, not supported by the statements of the responsible officials. Section 3, again, narrative 3, Sweden not listening to experts or data, but of course they kept pointing to the country's chief epidemiologist, who is in fact an expert, and they were listening to him. And that's an interesting point. He just had a different conclusion about what might be effective in Sweden. Again, just to remind you, the others, you can read on your own their treatment of whether or not Sweden was, quote, not following World Health Organization recommendations. Narrative 5, the Swedish approach is not working and Sweden has or will change course. Now, that's something that has made it through into our narrative, and I guess I'll have to double check on that, but we won't have time to do that today. But that'll be a portion of interest as well. And then, of course, narrative 6, Swedes trust the government. And you might have concluded that really wasn't necessarily as simple as it sounded. The conclusions here, I think we've pretty much covered pretty well, but there's this formal conclusion section. We'll jump out of the article at the moment, though, just because we're running low on time as it is. Let's see. Any short items that we might want to toss in for consideration before closing out for the day? Yes. You know what? Darwin Darko had sent me this. I didn't bring it up at the beginning, although I thought about leading off the show with this one because I had retweeted, unwillingly really, retweeted a Lincoln Project tweet declaring a newly compiled spoof video of the Axios interview with Donald Trump, and declaring it to be genius and wanting to know who did it. I don't know that it was so much genius per se, but it was certainly very funny and entertaining. What the person did here was they took Trump and flipped him and put him in, photoshopped him into both seats and had him argue with himself with his various lines of gibberish and bullshit. And it really was quite entertaining and worth doing. But now I guess we have a link to the YouTube video of it, so we can, in fact, I guess, credit the right person here, unless they've stolen it. Justin T. Brown is the name that's on the YouTube account here. And I'll give you the link that Darwin provided us for it. Donald Trump. It's entitled Donald Trump is the Dumbest Man in America. And then it says 2. So I don't know whether this is the second version of it or his second proof that he is the dumbest man in America, or whether that's some kind of a footnote. It's quite interesting, and it wouldn't do for us to simply steal the thing and play all, what is it? This looks like maybe an early version, or maybe only part of it. I saw, I think, a 2-minute compilation of this gibberish. I'll include, I guess, a link to both, even though I don't love linking to Lincoln Project stuff, but you'll be able to see it, and thanks to Darwin's sharp eye here, we'll be able to share this version of it with you too. I don't know if it was his intention to point to this as the origin of it or not, but it seems likely that was the case. All right, let's see. Other things that we might be able to share quickly or point to. Yes, maybe tomorrow, depending on Greg's internet connection, we can share some portion of, if not the entirety of, that Vanity Fair article about Jared Kushner's secret testing plan and how it went poof into thin air. We got an update on more stupid things that Jared Kushner is apparently in charge of. And apparently I saw a tweet go by, and I'll have to track down the provenance of it and see what kind of facts and sources are behind it. But I guess Jared is being assigned the task of preparing the litigation strategy for declaring all of the Democratic votes by mail in the various states that they might win in the general election to be invalid, to see them impounded by the Justice Department and taking their case all the way to the Supreme Court in order to try to invalidate those ballots and support Republican states or states with Republican legislatures who make the bold move of sending a second slate of electors to Washington, D.C. to further muddy the waters. I don't know what qualifies him for that, but what qualifies him for anything, really. Well, anyway, time to stay tuned for that news and more from the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy coming up next with Justice Putnam. Let's see what I can cram in after this brief announcement about what's most important in his book.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
All right, here's what we got. The Iowa governor says schools are defying the law if they follow health guidelines. The dirty Republican plan to cut the census short, forgot about that one, is potentially illegal. And high-flying Virgin Atlantic filed for U.S. bankruptcy protection. Internationally, Malaysian police raided the office of Al Jazeera. Find out why next.